The community center in Burlington, Vermont, wasn't much to look at. Peeling paint, flickering lights, and chairs that creaked louder than they should. But that Tuesday morning, it held something more than chipped walls and forgotten budgets. It held a quiet kind of hope. The Emotional Arts Workshop wasn't advertised on any fancy flyer. Just a few words typed in bold on a bulletin board, a space for children to express what words cannot. Among the 6 children enrolled, one sat entirely still. His name was Ethan Blake, and at just 10 years old, he had seen more darkness than most would in a lifetime. A year ago, Ethan had been kidnapped while walking home from school. For 3 days, his whereabouts were unknown. When the police finally rescued him, something fundamental inside him had shattered. Since then he hadn't spoken a word, not to his father, not to therapists, not to the endless stream of specialists flown in by private jet. His wide gray eyes didn't blink in surprise anymore. They simply watched. Or avoided. Gregory Blake, his father, stood behind a one-way glass that morning, his jaw clenched tighter than his fists. 63 years old, self-made billionaire, and utterly powerless when it came to the one person who mattered. He had tried everything money could buy, neurologists, trauma experts, even a state-of-the-art therapy dog flown in from Switzerland. Nothing reached the boy. Inside the classroom, the children sat in a circle, papers and crayons before them. The instructor, an older woman with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, moved slowly from child to child. When she reached Ethan, she didn't speak. Instead, she gently placed a hand-drawn card in front of him, a simple sketch of a boy sitting beside a floppy-eared dog under a tree. Then she moved on. For a long moment, Ethan didn't react. But then, ever so slowly, his small fingers reached forward and touched the card. And for the first time in 12 months, he lifted his eyes, not to the drawing, but to the woman walking away. Behind the glass, Gregory's breath caught in his throat. Something had shifted. Gregory hadn't expected much. Truth be told, he was out of hope. The emotional expression through art class at the Burlington Community Center was more of a last-ditch attempt than a genuine solution. His assistants had arranged it, citing some obscure study about the healing power of creativity. Gregory barely listened. At this point, he would try anything, even this. He stood behind the observation window, arms folded tightly across his chest, his gaze locked on the small figure sitting apart from the others. Ethan. His son. Once so full of life, the boy now moved like a ghost, his shoulders hunched, his face unreadable. Gregory's heart ached every time he looked at him, but Ethan never looked back. Inside the classroom, children sat quietly with crayons and paper, while an elderly woman slowly made her way around the room. Helen Marsh didn't wear a name tag. She didn't carry a clipboard. What she carried was something far older, an instinct, the kind that only comes from decades of listening to little voices and noticing the tiny details adults often missed. She knelt by each child, spoke softly, offered a kind word, a question, a compliment on a doodle. Then she approached Ethan. But she didn't speak. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small hand-drawn card. It was simple, just a pencil sketch of a boy sitting beside a floppy-eared dog under a tree. No bright colors, no dramatic flourish. Just warmth and quiet company. She placed the card gently on the table in front of Ethan. Then she stood and walked away. Gregory leaned forward instinctively, breath held. Ethan didn't move at first. The room felt suspended in time. Then slowly, his small hand reached out. His fingers trembled as they touched the edge of the card. He picked it up, stared at it. And then, he lifted his head. For the first time in 12 long months, his eyes met another human being's. He looked straight at Helen, who was now helping another child across the room. Behind the glass, Gregory's vision blurred. He had just witnessed a miracle, and the woman who performed it hadn't said a single word. The next morning, long before the center opened its doors to the public, Helen Marsh found herself straightening chairs and setting out fresh crayons, just as she had done every day for the past week. She didn't expect visitors, especially not the kind who wore tailored suits and arrived in sleek black cars. Gregory Blake stepped into the room quietly, his presence far too large for the tiny classroom. But today, his face was different. Less guarded. More human. Helen looked up from her stack of papers, surprised but not unsettled. She didn't rush to greet him. She waited. "I owe you a thank you," Gregory began, his voice lower than usual, almost hesitant. "And a request." Helen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He stepped closer, holding his hat in both hands. "I saw what happened yesterday. With Ethan. That moment, it meant more than I can explain. You reached him in a way no one else has. I want to ask, would you consider working with him? One-on-one. At my home." There was no pitch, no offer of money, yet. Just a father asking for help. Helen gave a soft sigh. "Mr. Blake, I'm 70 years old. I've been retired for a decade. I don't have credentials in therapy or psychology. I'm just an old teacher with a box of crayons and too many stories." Gregory smiled faintly. "Exactly. That's what makes you different." He paused, then added, "Please. Just come see him again. If you say no after that, I'll understand." Helen studied him, then nodded slowly. One visit. To see the boy with the quiet eyes. And that was how it began, not with a contract, but with a quiet promise and the echo of a moment neither of them could forget. Helen poured 2 cups of lukewarm tea from the community center's old kettle. The silence between them was almost comfortable, save for the tension in Gregory's shoulders as he sat across from her, clearly unused to waiting for answers. "I appreciate your offer," Helen finally said, sliding a mug toward him. "But I've been retired a long time, Mr. Blake. I don't think I'm the solution you're looking for." Gregory didn't touch the tea. His hands remained clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles pale. "You may have retired from teaching, but yesterday proved you haven't stopped being a teacher." She gave a small smile, half regret, half amusement. "I'm just an old woman with chalk dust in her memories. I don't have the training. What Ethan needs, what you need, is someone with degrees, methods, experience with trauma." He shook his head slowly. "We've tried all of that. Spent more than I care to admit. None of it reached him. But when you placed that card in front of him, he looked up. He saw you." Helen looked away, eyes clouded. "Sometimes a moment like that is just luck." Gregory's voice softened. "If it was luck, then it was the first we've had in a year." He leaned forward. "I can pay you any amount. That's not a concern." Helen let out a quiet breath and met his eyes. "Money's never been the reason I do anything, Mr. Blake." "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm asking you." For a long while, Helen said nothing. Then she looked down at her hands, weathered and still stained with a bit of charcoal. "I'll come. But not for a job. I just want to see the boy with a broken smile again." Helen stood at the edge of the long stone driveway, staring up at the towering estate that loomed before her like something out of a painting. The Blake residence wasn't just a house, it was a statement. Grand columns, manicured hedges, windows tall enough to see the sky. And yet, despite all its elegance, it felt strangely hollow. Too perfect. Too quiet. She adjusted the scarf around her neck and took a breath. A part of her still questioned why she was here. She had spent her life in modest classrooms with sticky floors and broken pencils, not marble foyers and security gates. But then she thought of the boy, the one with the tired eyes and trembling hands. The boy who hadn't spoken in a year, but had looked up, if only for a moment, when she gave him that simple drawing. That memory alone had brought her here. The front door opened before she could knock. A housekeeper greeted her politely, but with a hint of curiosity, as if unsure why someone like Helen belonged in a place like this. Gregory soon appeared, suit jacket off for once, sleeves rolled. "Thank you for coming," he said. Helen gave a small nod. "I'm not here for a job, Mr. Blake. I'm not a miracle worker." He didn't smile. "I'm not asking for a miracle. Just a second chance." She glanced around the cold beauty of the house, then looked him in the eye. "I didn't come for you. I came to see the boy with the sad eyes. That's all." Gregory stepped aside and Helen walked in, carrying nothing but a worn leather bag, a box of colored pencils, and a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, yesterday's moment wasn't just a flicker, but the beginning of something real. The inside of the Blake estate was everything Helen expected, and nothing she understood. Marble floors so polished they mirrored the chandelier light above. Grand staircases that curved like sculptures. Walls adorned with art that likely cost more than her entire pension. Everything in its place. Immaculate. Silent. Yet beneath all the elegance, there was something missing. Life. Helen moved through the grand foyer slowly, her soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the cold floor. A vase of imported lilies stood perfectly still on a hallway table, not a single petal out of place. Not a toy in sight. No scattered shoes or crumpled drawings. No fingerprints on the glass. It was a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Gregory led her past several rooms, formal sitting areas, a private library, even a music room with a grand piano no one seemed to play. "Everything you'll need is here," he said as they reached a smaller room tucked away near the back of the house. It had once been a study, but now looked like someone had tried to make it into something softer. A few beanbags, a small table with art supplies arranged neatly in glass jars, and in the corner, a child-sized easel with a blank sheet of paper waiting. Helen set down her worn bag and looked around quietly. "No one spends much time in here," Gregory admitted. "We thought making a space might help, but nothing ever stuck." Helen didn't answer right away. She moved to the easel, ran her fingers across the paper's edge, then looked out the large window facing the backyard. Perfect lawn, trimmed hedges, not a single leaf out of place. She sighed softly. "Perfection," she murmured, "can be awfully lonely." It didn't take long for Helen to notice the glances. They weren't overtly cruel, no one said anything unkind outright, but the message was clear enough. The housekeeper smiled politely, but her eyes skimmed Helen's modest shoes and second-hand coat with faint amusement. The young nanny, dressed in pressed khakis and a branded polo, offered a forced greeting, then promptly busied herself with her phone. And the private physician, a man with salt and pepper hair and credentials lining his every sentence, barely acknowledged Helen at all. "She has no formal training," Helen overheard him mutter once in the hallway, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that she was just around the corner. No child psychology degree. No trauma certification. Just a retired schoolteacher with a sketchbook. Helen said nothing. She had heard worse in her decades of teaching. Judgments were easy when made from behind a clipboard. Still, the subtle dismissals stung in ways she hadn't expected. This wasn't a classroom where every effort was met with open arms. This was a fortress of expertise, where titles carried more weight than intuition, and age was more liability than wisdom. But she didn't come to prove anyone wrong. She came for Ethan. So she quietly unpacked her worn box of colored pencils, sharpened each one with care, and began to draw, deliberately gently, on a fresh sheet of paper. No fanfare. No explanations. Just a quiet act of faith in the small boy who hadn't spoken in a year. Let them doubt her, she thought. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here to remind one child, just one, that someone still saw him, even when the world had stopped looking. Helen never gave instructions. She didn't stand at the easel and teach, didn't ask Ethan to draw or speak or respond. She simply arrived each morning, unpacked her worn leather bag, and quietly took a seat at the small table across the room from him. With slow, practiced strokes, she began to draw, simple things at first. A tree. A small house. A boy chasing a dog through a field. She didn't explain the images. She let them live on the page, unbothered by interpretation. Occasionally she would speak, her voice soft, almost like a breeze through an open window. There once was a little boy named Greg, she'd say, sketching a crooked smile on the figure in her drawing. He used to hide frogs in his teacher's desk. One time, he snuck a kitten into the classroom, swore it was for a science project. She never looked directly at Ethan when she spoke, never forced a reaction. She simply let the story settle into the space between them. Each day, a new tale about Greg, mischievous, kind-hearted, always curious. A boy with dirt on his knees and stars in his eyes. And always, the dog followed close behind in the drawings, floppy-eared and loyal. Ethan never spoke. But after a week, Helen noticed something new. One afternoon, she returned from washing her brushes to find her latest drawing had been altered. In the bottom corner, a tiny dog, drawn in shaky, childlike lines, had been added. She didn't mention it. She just smiled, picked up a fresh sheet of paper, and began again. This time, she drew 2 figures under the tree. And the stories of Greg continued, because somehow, they weren't just stories anymore. They were bridges. Gregory stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching in silence as Helen sketched another quiet scene at the table. Ethan sat nearby, not drawing, not speaking, just watching her with those same unreadable eyes. After a long moment, Gregory stepped into the room, his voice sharp but restrained. "It's been 2 weeks." Helen didn't look up. Her pencil moved gently across the page. "I've kept quiet," he continued, "but I need to ask, what exactly are you doing here?" Helen paused, her hand resting over the half-finished outline of a boy sitting beneath a tree. "I'm drawing," she said simply. Gregory's tone tightened. "That's not enough. I hired you to help my son. And so far, all I've seen are fairy tales and crayons." She finally met his eyes, calm and unshaken. "You didn't hire me," she replied. "You asked me to see him. I'm doing that." Gregory took a step closer, his frustration barely contained. "I need results, Ms. Marsh. Progress. I can't afford to waste time on—" "On what?" she interrupted softly. "Something that doesn't fit into a chart or a checklist?" He stared at her. Helen set down her pencil and folded her hands. "You've built walls around that boy so high no one can reach him, not even you. I'm not here to fix him, Mr. Blake. I'm here to knock gently at the door you've kept locked." Silence filled the room. Then she picked up her pencil and returned to the drawing, this time, adding a second figure beside the boy, hand outstretched. Gregory didn't reply. But he didn't walk away, either. The video was only 37 seconds long. Grainy black and white footage from a hallway security camera. It showed a dimly lit doorway, slightly ajar. Then, a sudden movement. A small figure stumbling out, barefoot and trembling. Ethan. Seconds later, Helen appeared, her robe wrapped tightly around her. She knelt, opened her arms, and Ethan collapsed into them, sobbing loud guttural cries that tore through the silence of the night. Helen held him close, rocking gently, whispering words the camera couldn't capture. By morning, the footage had been leaked. No one knew how it got out. But within hours, headlines spread like wildfire. Retired teacher caught in emotional embrace with billionaire's son. Too close? Critics question elderly woman's role in Blake household. Who is Helen Marsh, and why was she alone with the boy? The images were everywhere, frozen screenshots of a woman holding a broken child, twisted into something suggestive, something suspicious. They didn't see the nightmare Ethan had woken from. They didn't hear the way he'd screamed for someone, anyone, to hold him. They didn't know he hadn't called out in over a year, and when he finally did, it was for her. But facts didn't matter. Not to the tabloids. Not to the whispering public. In the quiet after the storm, Gregory stood in his office, the screen still glowing with headlines, jaw clenched, eyes unreadable. Helen hadn't tried to defend herself. She hadn't said a word. But the damage was done. And for the first time since Ethan had come home, the house felt even colder than before. Gregory didn't knock. He entered the art room with quick, heavy steps, the tension in his jaw unmistakable. Helen was seated at the small table, quietly rinsing brushes in a cup of water. She looked up, sensing the storm before he even spoke. His voice was low, but laced with fury. "Was it part of your plan?" Helen blinked, confused. "I don't understand." He held up his phone, the tabloid article open in glaring headlines. "This. All of this. The cameras caught you in the middle of the night, holding my son like—" He stopped himself, breathing hard. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Playing the part. Getting close so I'd trust you." Helen's hands remained steady. "He had a nightmare. He came to me. I did what any human being would do." Gregory's eyes flared. "You had no right. You're not family. You're not a therapist. You shouldn't have even been alone with him." She stood then, not defensive, just tired. "You think I wanted cameras? Headlines? I held a frightened child who asked for help. That's all." But Gregory wasn't listening. He turned away, pacing. "I let you in because you were different. I believed you cared." "I do," she said softly. His voice turned cold. "Then respect what I'm asking. Pack your things. Leave. Today." Helen didn't argue. She gathered her pencils, her sketchbook, the small tin of candies Ethan had once pushed toward her in silence. No goodbyes. No explanations. Only as she reached the door did she pause, and set down a folder of drawings. "He's starting to tell his story," she whispered. "You just haven't looked." And then she walked out, as quietly as she had come in. Helen didn't slam the door. She didn't cry, or plead, or try to explain herself. Instead, she returned quietly to the small room where she and Ethan had spent their mornings. The colored pencils still lay scattered across the table. A half-finished drawing waited on the easel, one she had begun that morning, showing two figures beneath a blooming tree, the dog curled between them. She folded it carefully and placed it into a folder already thick with Ethan's sketches. Drawings he had added in secret. Silent progress. Unspoken healing. She took her time arranging them, tender hands guiding each page into order, like placing memories into a scrapbook no one had asked for. Then she wrote a single sentence on the inside cover. "I only wanted to help him smile again, like you once smiled at me 40 years ago." No signature. No accusations. Just the truth. She placed the folder on Gregory's desk, beside a silver pen he never used, and turned away without another glance. As she walked through the grand halls of the estate one final time, not a single person stopped her. No one offered a word. It was as if she were a shadow, something meant to be forgotten. But behind her, she left more than a folder. She left stories drawn in crayon. Gentle laughter tucked between pencil lines. A small boy's courage, slowly blooming on the page. She didn't need to be remembered. She only needed Ethan to be seen. And if Gregory ever opened that folder, truly opened it, he would find not just his son's progress, but a memory of his own smile, long buried in time. The house was quieter than usual. Gregory sat alone in his study, the folder Helen had left still unopened on the desk. It had been 2 days since she walked out, and though the headlines had begun to fade, a heavier silence remained, inside the house and within him. He hadn't meant to open the box of old school records. It was buried deep in a cabinet, one of many things his assistant had digitized years ago. But something about Helen's final words clung to him like fog. "Like you once smiled at me 40 years ago." He pulled out the file marked Roosevelt Elementary, class of 1983. Names typed on yellowing paper. Scribbled notes in red pen. And then, there it was. Gregory Blake, Grade 1, Teacher, Helen Marsh. His breath caught. It hit him all at once. The faint memory of a warm voice reading aloud during rainy afternoons, of peppermints offered after scraped knees, of a silver-haired woman who once told him he had the kindest eyes she'd ever seen. He hadn't remembered her face until now. But he remembered the feeling. The knock at the door came gently. It was Maria, one of the housekeepers. "Sir," she said, hesitant. "Forgive me, but about that night, when the video was taken." Gregory looked up. "Ethan had a nightmare," she said. "He ran down the hall, crying louder than I've ever heard. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't for attention. He was terrified. And she, Ms. Marsh, she held him like a grandmother would. Rocked him, whispered to him until he fell asleep again. I saw it. With my own eyes." Gregory said nothing. His throat felt tight. Maria looked at the drawings still spread across the desk. That woman didn't come here for money. She came for him. Left alone once more, Gregory opened the folder at last. And there, page after page, were pieces of his son's heart, drawn gently, carefully, beside the woman who had once taught him how to read. And perhaps, without knowing it, had come back to teach him how to love. The study was dimly lit, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Gregory sat at his desk, the once pristine folder now open before him. The papers inside were worn at the edges, some slightly smudged with graphite, others with faint fingerprints, a child's fingerprints. He turned the pages slowly, as if afraid they might crumble under the weight of his guilt. Each drawing told a silent story. In one, a boy sat beneath a tree, a small dog curled at his feet. Beside him stood a woman with silver hair, her hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. In another, the same woman was shown offering the boy a book, while the dog chased butterflies nearby. There were dozens of them. Sometimes the boy was smiling. Sometimes, just watching. But the woman, Helen, was always there. Soft lines shaped her face. Her eyes were kind. Her posture patient. She wasn't drawn like a guest or a stranger. She was drawn like home. Gregory leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. All this time, he had demanded charts, results, measurable proof. And yet, the clearest sign had been in front of him all along, penciled into the corners of his son's quiet world. He picked up one of the sketches, a scene of the boy reaching for the dog while the woman laughed, her head tilted back. The laugh wasn't visible, of course. But it was there. You could feel it in the lines, the way the pencil danced across the page. Gregory pressed the drawing to his chest and closed his eyes. He had been wrong. Not just about Helen. About everything. He had built a fortress of silence, mistaking it for safety. And somehow, Helen had walked through it with nothing but a tin of pencils and a heart full of patience. In her quiet way, she had reached his son. And now he needed to find her. Before it was too late. The apartment building was old, brick facade weathered by time, a creaky front door that groaned with each visitor. Gregory climbed the narrow staircase alone, a small cardboard box tucked carefully beneath one arm. Inside, something shifted gently, letting out a faint, questioning whimper. He stopped in front of apartment 2B and took a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Then, he knocked. Helen answered in a housecoat, her hair pinned loosely, glasses resting low on her nose. She didn't look surprised to see him, just tired. "Mr. Blake," she said, evenly. He didn't speak at first. He simply held out the box. Helen glanced down. Inside sat a tiny golden puppy, floppy-eared and wide-eyed, tail wagging slowly. It looked exactly like the dog in Ethan's drawings. Gregory cleared his throat. He talks about the dog in every sketch. I thought, maybe it was time we made him real. Helen's eyes softened, but she said nothing. Gregory looked down, ashamed. I was wrong. About everything. About you. He hesitated. I don't know how to fix what I broke. But I was hoping, maybe you could help him keep drawing. Then more quietly, almost like a confession, and maybe you could help me learn how to be his father again. Helen didn't answer right away. She reached into the box, lifted the trembling puppy into her arms, and smiled for the first time in weeks. "Come inside," she said gently. "We'll start with the crayons." The front door of the Blake estate opened slowly, just as the afternoon light spilled across the marble floor. Helen stepped inside, the tiny golden puppy cradled in her arms, its tail wagging in soft, hopeful beats. Gregory walked beside her, quieter than usual, but not with shame anymore, with something closer to gratitude. The house, once so still, seemed to breathe again. And then they heard it, soft taps against the floor. A slow, uneven rhythm. Helen turned toward the sound. Ethan. He was in the hallway, gripping the sides of a small walker. His movements were careful, his legs uncertain, but he was moving toward her. Helen's breath caught. He had never stood before. Not since the trauma. Not without assistance. But now, with sheer determination written across his pale face, Ethan took one unsteady step after another. And then, without a word, he let go of the walker and fell gently into her arms. Helen dropped to her knees to catch him, the puppy nestled between them, tail thumping wildly. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't have to. His arms around her said everything. Behind them, Gregory stood frozen, eyes misted, hand pressed to his chest. He had witnessed many powerful things in his life, deals closed, towers built, fortunes made. But none of it compared to the quiet miracle unfolding in his hallway. A boy. A teacher. A dog from a drawing. And a single trembling hug that healed what ached the most. In the weeks that followed, the house began to change. There was laughter now, soft at first, then fuller. Crayon marks occasionally appeared on tabletops. Sketches were taped to the fridge. The once sterile halls echoed with footsteps that no longer tiptoed around silence. And in the center of it all was Ethan, still quiet, still healing, but no longer invisible. Helen visited every afternoon, never with an agenda, always with a story. Sometimes about Greg, the mischievous boy from long ago. Other times, she just listened, because some stories lived best in the spaces between words. Gregory watched it all unfold, day by day. And in that watching, he began to change too. He had spent a lifetime commanding boardrooms and controlling outcomes. But this required surrender, patience, presence. He came to realize something he had forgotten long ago, that love wasn't loud, and healing didn't always look like progress charts or polished speeches. Sometimes, it looked like a boy holding a pencil for the first time in months. Sometimes, it looked like a woman sitting quietly beside him. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the garden, Gregory stood beside Helen and whispered, "You didn't just save him, you reminded me how to be his father." Helen smiled, her eyes crinkling with age and knowing. "A real teacher," she said softly, "never really retires. We just wait for the next heart that needs healing." And as the golden puppy chased fireflies across the lawn and Ethan's laughter rang out under the fading light, Gregory understood. He hadn't just changed Helen's life. She had changed his. From the very beginning. If this story touched your heart, leave a like to help spread kindness. And if you believe the world needs more heartfelt stories like this one, hit subscribe and stay with us on this journey. Thank you for watching until the end. We'll see you in the next story.